Live on location in New York City, uptown, in Manhattan. Yo, I'm lounging with this brother Tony Taylor. He got a lot of informative information about the history of, basketball uptown in New York City area and everything like that. What's happening, brother Tony?
How you doing?
All right, peace, man. Yeah, check it out. We at the battlegrounds right now. We was just kicking a little conversation about the history of the battlegrounds and your involvement. And why don't you let the viewing audience know a little something about that?
Okay, the battlegrounds was one of the first original parks that mostly all the premier basketball players came to at one particular time or another to either look, spectate, watch, and we had a lot of good games here. And Joe Hammond, a few Earl Manigault, Human Helicopter, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
What are some of the things that you see needed from the community and within the city, period, as far as, doing more positive things like this within the community involving the kids and the youth and everything like that?
Well, there's a lot of kids around here, and it needs to be involved with a lot of the youth organizations, especially some of the stores. If they can contribute some of those finances that they get from the community, we would lovely and be able to happy to print up the right kind of shirts, because this tournament is put together by basically the kids this year.
Right.
The kids just put their own teams together and they form their own little crew. But I've recently moved, and I had the tournament for 8 years, and it ran pretty well. And at one time, a guy named Reggie Wells, he gave me the torch, and he passed it on to me in '85.
It's definitely a lot of hard work involved that a lot of people don't really understand as far as organizing a tournament, gathering up a group of kids and having a successful showing to the community. It's definitely a hard work. And I'm sure the community appreciates the job that you've done throughout the years and everything like that. So I'll tell you what, since we right here lounging, why don't we just check out the game for a little while, and we'll be back on the Underground Railroad, all right? GBA. Peace.
Freedom Radio.
Let's do this, man. We want to let's paint a picture again. 1997 was Diamond D's second album, and that was the Passions, Infidelity, Hatred, Passions, and Infidelity album. Diamond D, classic artist from Digging in the Crates. That album was definitely doing its thing. Reasonable Doubt, Jay-Z's first album, was 96. Let's see, the infamous Mobb Deep, that second album of theirs was 95. We're coming off of Nas's Illmatic in 94. And let's call out some other names just to kind of. Tupac's All Eyes on Me was 96, and Mos Def and Talib Kweli's Black on Both Sides was 99. One other album I'd like to mention during this time period was Gangstar's Hard to Earn album in 94. So, and also one other one, because this is some of my joints of fond memory during this time period, was OC, his album, Jewel's album in 1997. So, there was some other, but I'm just trying to give the listening audience in hip hop. And then also you had movies that came out, Soul in the Hole that came out, and it covered a street basketball tournament in New York at the time. And it had an excellent soundtrack, but that was also produced by Wu-Tang, members of Wu-Tang Clan. And their song, Soul in the Hole, the actual title of this documentary, was around this time period too. So we have to kind of put ourselves in the music to understand really kind of the culture that we're dealing with at that time. And, between 97 or 96 and even prior to, let's just say from 94 to 99, was just a powerful energy in the community. And like we said, this energy impacted everything around it. And this was before the commodification of hip-hop culture just that went rampant by corporate America. At this time, people are still trying to figure out how to package up this energy and sell it and potentially misdirect that energy. So the East Coast, West Coast battles that came out of corporate America's magazines, the Source, and what was the other magazine at the time period that Kevin Powell wrote for? Quincy Jones's magazine, Vibe. Yes, Vibe at the time. This is all around that energy, you know. And again, coming off of this hard, intense struggle of crack, and it's just consequences that it had on all levels of family, community institutions, leadership, public schools, all things around this. So I'm trying to give the listening audience just kind of a backdrop of what was happening culturally outside of sports at that particular time. So now here we are in the city of Minneapolis. We have Doug Hartmann, who finds himself involved in a city-funded initiative with two people that came up with a concept independently of the city that dealt with this kind of cultural influence on basketball, called the Ghetto Basketball Association. And so, Doug, for this part of the interview, let's just have you ask some questions, and then we'll get back after that to talk more about your study around not only the GBA, but your broader studies, and get more specific into your book and kind of what you feel your book had to offer for this particular time and place and space of basketball. So go ahead, Doug. Why don't you take over the interview?
I just want to ask you, so that tour of the music and culture of the moment, that might have been for historical recollection for your audience. It's like just education for me in some ways. I don't know a lot about that. You know, I grew up in southern Missouri, mostly white area, rural kind of part. But I do remember, and this is what I want to ask you about. So we got connected because I thought it was a basketball league, and you were always like, it's way more than that. And it was you try to tell me about the music, and it was the style. I mean, like, I still got some of your T-shirts and stuff. My son still wears one of your GBA T-shirts because it has a look and a cool style. So maybe walk back through that a little bit for me, because I think I still remember that, but I'd love to hear you talk about how you saw all this fitting together, because that was part of my education. It wasn't just basketball; it was the whole community, it was a whole social movement that for you was just one little piece of it. And I think the danger for the city, they always only saw one part, and even for me, you know, as a scholar, I was looking at one aspect, and you're reminding me how much you always see and saw that it was bringing together and that was going on. So maybe talk a little bit about, even like, I remember your vision of GBA as this hub of all kinds of forms of entertainment and culture.
Yeah. Oh, it was definitely threatening for the politics of the city and for those who are fearful of self-determination. I think at the center of everything around this particular league, even the name itself, Ghetto Basketball Association, was very intentional. It definitely let you know where exactly we were coming from. We weren't trying to be pleasing or political to anyone. We wanted to tap into that free energy that basketball represented at that particular time period. Again, those who hoop and play the sport on any level know that it's full of politics. And those politics, like we said a little earlier, usually show up in the style of play. So something very similar, you know, you have a free spirit. Everyone who values having a free spirit understands that when that spirit is kind of chained up or locked in a certain place of submission, it doesn't have a chance to fully breathe and express itself. And that is for basketball or any kind of art, or even, I would think, even in academia to a certain extent. And our purpose of providing this as a community platform at that particular time period was to showcase black folks who understood the value and the need of free expression in sports. And in this case, it was basketball. It was a place where people could come and fellowship with one another. It was a place that people could come and value one another, and the relationships that we have together in our communities when we do have things that bring us together in an organized fashion to achieve a goal. So, for example, I can say, and for everybody who played and participated in the Ghetto Basketball Association in the city of Minneapolis at this time period, understood that there was ownership from the top level all the way down to the person who brought their son or daughter to the game, and people understood that we want to keep this thing going. We don't want to mess this up. We want to, everybody that played in the GBA, I can pretty much say for the most part, held this together and wouldn't let any kind of negative influences or negative distractions ruin it. Because at that particular time, we all came together with this love for the sport and with this need to showcase our creative talents that everybody brought in to the gym with them when they showed up to play in the league. And I thought that was something that was very important, that sense of ownership that everybody, I think, bought into.
Yeah, I love that language you're using, because I was just, as you were, even before you said, I was thinking everybody felt like a sense of ownership, like it was the community was who was making this and who took control of it. Let me ask you something on that, because along the way of how you're just describing it, you said you didn't think of that as political. But from my point of view, like academic point of view, okay, talk a little bit about that, like, because to me, well, let me frame it like this. A lot of times people will talk about race in sports or just sports and say it's not political. It's not supposed to be political. But what you're describing, now it's not political like Democrats and Republicans or like the legislature, but talk a little bit about why it's so significant, whether we call that politics or not, that kind of idea about community ownership, about freedom, about creativity and vitality.
Ownership is always political, and more specifically, black ownership of narrative or institution is even more political and threatening. So putting it into a cultural context, this is Wu-Tang Clan came out and they changed a lot of things within hip-hop culture at that time when they claimed ownership to their brand. And they had a group of 7 people or more that ended up signing with different labels at the time to maximize their positions of ownership, not to be just a commodity of one corporate entity. So, for example, this is also a time period where Bad Boy Records came out. With the brother named Sean Combs, and he moved to separate himself from just being a subsidiary on a record label. He moved to establish his own record label with distribution. You know, you have Death Row Records that came out and did the same thing. You know, there was a lot of movement around ownership at this point in time. A lot of movement around having more control over your narrative. And on a very simple level here locally in Minneapolis with this basketball league and the politics of city funding, quote unquote, community leadership and management, to come out with a league that fought every step of the way to own its identity and own its application and value system in the context of working with the city was an interesting road to walk. And I would say it was just posed a tremendous threat to the system of exploitation that many times people who come up with innovative ideas and move to establish those ideas in the community. There's a dance that sometimes you have to play, and most of the times in that relationship with certain funding sources, different people bow down and they lose control of their brand, or, and in this case, this idea of this basketball league that we had, and you saw that playing out, I'm sure, in the time period that you were able to actually make observations on that.
So I almost don't have to ask you anything. You just keep going, like, from the next theme is in my mind. You're already starting to talk to it.
Was I clear on that?
Oh, absolutely. No, because I was thinking about, like, what's the opposition, the resistance that you faced, and you're already working through that. Let me ask you this, though. This will go bring it up to date, maybe. So a few weeks ago, part of how we reconnected was my son comes to me, who's in his early 20s now. He's like, hey, I heard this dude talking. His name is Ralph Crowder. And he remembered you. You left an impression. It was at the Minnesota History Center about cultural production from diverse communities. And what you said, which he didn't even know we knew each other or that you were the subject of something I had written about. We put it together later. But he's like, yeah, and this guy was, he's like, he was talking about how it was hard for you to do your production because you won't take money or you don't want to have strings attached to the cultural things that you're doing. So maybe could you just go back through that a little bit, because it left such an impression on my son, kind of your vision of your creative control of your own work and of your own product, because I think you're still staying true to that, whether it's in basketball or your podcasts or documentaries or whatever it is. So do you want to maybe say a little bit more about that and maybe bring us up to date on some of your experiences with that, why that's so hard, and what kind of constraints that puts on you when, you do need some resources and support to do the things you're trying to do.
I mean, what you just defined is really the modern day struggle of an artist, or an intellectual, a parent, of many different things, and it takes on a different context culturally when you have to deal with the politics of being black in America. And I think when you look at any of the issues that we have in our community, in the black community, that stemmed from even this idea to have a creative way to offer opportunities or a platform using sports in a league called the Ghetto Basketball Association, it is imperative that you have to maintain a certain ownership of your brand, of your concept, of the values, of the pain that really go behind a lot of the ideas. I mean, usually a lot of great ideas come through significant experiences of trial and error, adversity, and other things. And in this whole kind of ever expanding struggle within the black community, when we lack ownership with those things, we are putting ourselves in positions many times to be treated less than human in many different ways. So it's imperative that, yes, some of us have to go and work and be in different places and play the politics of access. But some of us have to stand for certain principles and values and potentially lose our ability to gain that kind of monetary, that support of money that institutions bring, whether it be cities, university campuses, nonprofit funding. And the politics of funding is a whole different thing. And for those that see the politics that are played specifically in communities that don't have ownership, using the black community as being, kind of a banner for this conversation. We have to stand, man. I mean, that's just the point blank period. We have to be willing to dribble the ball between our legs, go up with a finger roll, or wear some shorts that might be a little baggy at the time because everybody else is wearing tight shorts. And we have to be able to stand for certain things that we see as not working for the best interest of free expression, wherever that is.
Dude, that's awesome on ideas, on intellectual, on control. Let me bring it back to the thing we started with about basketball and sports, because here's what I'm interested in. What I'm always thinking about is sports, especially basketball, seems like this arena where black folks have a lot of power, have a lot of autonomy and creativity. But in other ways, I think you're saying it's been taken over with the commodification or the marketization. So say a little bit about how that dynamic or that dialectic you're talking about staying true to your ideas in your community, specifically how hard that is to negotiate and maneuver in the realm of sports and in the realm of basketball. And I'm thinking here of Minneapolis right now, where you got a college team and a pro team that look like they're on the rise. So talk about that a little bit, because I think that brings us up to date.
Wow, that's a good one, Doug. Man, I think the pain is the thing that is at the center of everything we're talking about. When at one time, in one place, right now, today, we can say the Timberwolves are on the rise. They are definitely they're making a buzz all the way from the street all the way to the corporate offices. Their franchise is now taking a place of having a certain value in the conversation nationally, internationally, as the game is international at this point. The Timberwolves is also basically, you could say, a black team. It's taking on a new identity than it has before.
Just a few years
Yeah, a rebranding, if you will, even down to the jerseys. A rebranding to where they play. There's been a lot of money invested into this new brand, this new black identity that's in some ways accepted in certain ways in this city or this state, using the Timberwolves as an example. But let's look at the conditions on the ground for black people that live in this city. Let's look at the conditions on the ground for black people who live in St. Paul. Let's look at Minnesota as a state being a national disaster for the average experiences of a black family earning probably less per capita than other black families. Even Mississippi is more progressive in black family earnings than Minnesota is. Minnesota has this interesting relationship with the state of Wisconsin, and we're in the North. We're not even dealing with the legacy of slavery. So at the same time, you have this team that's just like went through a different kind of phase in its growth and its commodified value in this state. What does it say when your community here is just totally on the different spectrum of that? And what does it say about where is the leadership? Where are the voices to stand for some of those issues, to make sure that maybe in some of the ways that this black team is covered in sports? Well, how many black media outlets do we have covering this team? And that's clearly a black team, but it's owned by a different kind of source. And is that lack of relationship reflective of the overall conditions that we see in the cities or the state. Again, this idea of ownership is so important, and it points back to like the GBA, or it points back to the importance of something like the Negro Baseball League at that time. What are we scared about? What are we scared about to have our own institutions, have our own organizations, have our own media, have our own schools, have our own whatever, clothing lines, or whatever the case may be, our own shopping centers? You have to have people that stand up to some of those issues, and usually those people and that stand up with those kind of issues, because it all really points back to money and the politics of money and the fear of money. Those people who usually stand up against those things, or who study those things, usually are the most attacked. And a lot of people don't like to be attacked because that's not a comfortable place. And so it kind of reminds me of, were we set up to be attacked? Coming out the gate and saying, look, we're the Ghetto Basketball Association. We're not like the neighborhood association of basketball players that love the sport. We are the Ghetto Basketball Association. And I don't know how, and maybe we can go back into this in the final phase of this as we begin to talk about your book. But how was that relationship, that identification, that value system that you saw, how did that interact with the politics of the city? And could have it been a sustainable relationship? Or was it a relationship designed to actually depart from each other? So why don't we talk about that when we come back from our next break, all right?
Freedom, free radio, 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 radio.